For
Oh
a
my
long time,
god!
MIzkif was one of the safest names on Twitch. Not because he avoided controversy completely, but because nothing ever seemed serious enough to stick. He was loud, emotional, sometimes reckless, but never truly dangerous to his own career. And more importantly, he was surrounded by people who reinforced that image. At the center of it all was OTK, a streaming organization built on friendship, humor, and community. OTK wasn't just a brand, it was a signal. If you were part of it, people assumed you were safe, trusted, and protected. MIzkif wasn't just a member, he was one of its faces. At the time, no one thought this would matter, but later it would become one of the most important details in the entire story. Before any lawsuit existed, before any documents surfaced, and before anyone started choosing sides, MIzkif's public image was simple. He was the loud guy who cared deeply about his friends. He cried on stream, apologized publicly, and involved his audience in almost everything he did. And that image worked, because when people see vulnerability, they tend to assume honesty. Emiru fit into this picture in a very different way. Where MIzkif was emotional and reactive, Emiru was quiet, reserved, and passive. She didn't argue on stream, she didn't escalate situations, and when drama happened around her, she usually disappeared rather than respond. At first, this contrast didn't seem important, but silence has a strange effect online. When one person talks and the other doesn't, the audience usually fills in the blanks themselves. And more often than not, they fill them incorrectly. The situation between MIzkif and Emiru didn't explode all at once. There was no single stream, no viral clip, no dramatic accusation that immediately changed public opinion. Instead, everything unfolded slowly, and that's what made it dangerous. When news of a lawsuit began circulating, most people didn't even understand what it was about. The headlines were vague, the details were unclear, and the reactions were immediate. Some people dismissed it as nothing serious. Others assumed it was just another piece of streamer drama that would disappear in a week. But what most people didn't realize was that this wasn't a public argument. It was a legal one. And legal situations don't move at the speed of Twitch chat. Early reactions followed a familiar pattern. Fans picked sides quickly, often based on loyalty rather than information. Clips were resurfaced, old interactions were reanalyzed, and small moments that once meant nothing were suddenly treated as evidence. At the same time, something else was happening. MIzkif wasn't responding the way people expected him to. There were no long emotional streams, no immediate breakdowns, no detailed explanations. Compared to how open he usually was, his silence felt unusual. But Emiru's silence felt even louder. She didn't go live to explain her side. She didn't post long threads. And she didn't correct any of the assumptions being made about her. To many viewers, this confirmed what they already believed. But confirmation bias doesn't care about accuracy. Behind the scenes, OTK was also being pulled into the situation, whether they wanted to be or not. Because when a public figure faces legal trouble, the organizations around them don't get to stay neutral. Sponsors notice, platforms notice, and silence becomes a liability. At this stage, nothing had officially ended. There were no announcements, no removals, no statements confirming guilt or innocence. But the atmosphere had changed. Suddenly, MIzkif wasn't just a streamer involved in a dispute. He was a risk. And that shift matters. Because when someone goes from being an asset to being a question mark, the way people treat them changes, even if nothing has been proven. This is where the idea of nice guys finishing last starts to quietly emerge. MIzkif had spent years building trust through openness. Emiru had spent years avoiding conflict by staying quiet. OTK had spent years presenting itself as a group built on friendship rather than structure. And now, all three of those traits were being tested at the same time. By the end of this early phase, one thing was already clear. Regardless of how the lawsuit would turn out, the story had already escaped their control. And once that happens, the outcome rarely favors the people who stay quiet the longest. But this was still only the beginning, because the part that actually made the lawsuit interesting hadn't happened yet. By the time new details began to surface, the tone surrounding the situation had completely shifted. This was no longer treated as background noise. It wasn't something people casually joked about on stream, and it definitely wasn't something OTK could quietly wait out. What changed wasn't just the information itself. It was how people started interpreting the past. Suddenly, actions that once seemed harmless were being revisited with suspicion. Old decisions were questioned, and moments of silence were no longer seen as maturity, but as avoidance. This is where timing becomes critical. In legal disputes, information doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, and each piece forces people to reevaluate what they thought they already understood. For MIzkif, this meant that his usual strategy, emotional transparency, didn't work anymore. Anything he said could be scrutinized. Anything he didn't say could be used against him. And responding too early or too late both carried risks. This is the position many creators never prepare for. They build careers on being open, spontaneous, and reactive. But lawsuits demand the opposite. They demand restraint, consistency, and silence. And silence doesn't play well on Twitch. As more attention turned toward the legal side of the situation, public sympathy became harder to predict. Some viewers began questioning whether MIzkif's good guy image had shielded him from criticism for too long. Others started reconsidering Emiru's silence, wondering if it had been misinterpreted from the start. But by now, perception had already hardened. Once an audience forms a narrative, correcting it becomes almost impossible. OTK found itself in an uncomfortable position. If they supported MIzkif too openly, they risked appearing dismissive of the situation. If they distanced themselves too quickly, they risked looking disloyal. And doing nothing at all wasn't an option. This is the cost of being a brand built on personalities rather than systems. Friendship works well when everything is stable. But when legal pressure enters the picture, structure matters more than loyalty. What made this situation especially complicated was the absence of clear villains. There were no dramatic confessions, no leaked messages that instantly changed everything, just a slow accumulation of doubt. And doubt is far more damaging than outrage. Because outrage burns fast, doubt lingers. As time passed, one uncomfortable pattern became impossible to ignore. The people who tried to stay calm, quiet, and reasonable were the ones losing control of the narrative, and the louder voices, even when they lacked information, were shaping public opinion. This is why nice guys finish last isn't just a saying in online spaces. It's a structural problem. Platforms reward immediacy, not accuracy. Audiences reward confidence, not caution. And algorithms don't wait for legal clarity. By the time the lawsuit was widely understood as serious, reputations had already shifted. Not because of a verdict, but because of absence. In the end, this lawsuit didn't just change how people saw MIzkif or Emiru. It changed how people viewed creator organizations entirely. It exposed how fragile image-based trust really is, and it showed how quickly silence, even when legally necessary, can be mistaken for guilt. There may eventually be resolutions, clarifications, or outcomes that never reach the same audience that formed their opinions early on. And that's the final irony. In a space built on live reactions and constant transparency, the moments that matter most often happen off camera, quietly, slowly, and by the time anyone speaks again, the story has already been written.